Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Russell, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. This time we're going to try, it's always third time's the charm, but you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Of course. My name's Russell Edwards, and in 2014, we disclosed to the world the true identity of Jack the Ripper.
Now, how would you have an interest in Jack the Ripper?
Well, that's interesting because what happened was I got to London in 1989, went to university, and one of my college friends lived in Bethnal Green. And he introduced me to the Bagel Bake, the bagel shop at the top end of Brick Lane. And then I just fell in love with it as he took me down, showed me all the curry houses. And it really does have this magnetic atmosphere. And straight away I was hooked and I've been going there ever since.
So, where'd you know to look when it came to the Jack the Ripper? Obviously, it's a popular topic. I think everyone historically has a top hat and some type of guy in a dark alley in their mind when they think of Jack the Ripper. But over here in the United States, I'd say it's not as much of a well-known story. It's popular with true crime podcasts and things of that sort, but there's not really a lot of information on it. It wasn't until recently when I learned about Ripperology that I was like, okay, there's that actual like group, of people that are interested in studying specifically the Jack the Ripper case, and that comes with many different theories.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, of course, that's a big question. I ask lots of the people that follow me on social media, what do you think Jack the Ripper looked like? And this image of top hat and tails, you could say it was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is one. Dracula, believe it or not, he walks around London with a top hat and tails. But that's really where it originates. Of course, none of it's true because he never did walk around with the top hat and tails. However, this is a story that's been, I would say, it's hallowed through the echoes of time for 136 years. And I think it really is to do with who he was. Who was this murderer? Who did this? Because he did go out over a 10-week period and murder 5 women and then just disappeared. I think that mystery is the one that captured. But I think more importantly is the name itself, Jack the Ripper. And that actually originated from a letter sent to the Central News Agency in London. And that was on what was called the Dear Boss letter, written in Reading. And the name Jack the Ripper is really what's carried this story. There was, I would say, more heinous or horrendous, but just equally as horrendous in the early 19th century, around 1811, called the Ratcliffe Highway murders, where 2 families were completely butchered, and yet nobody really knows much about that. So I do think this enduring mystery is a lot to do with the name, and it's sort of set in the psyche of, I would say, the world. Because most people, I even remember Michael Jackson going, "I'm not Jack the Ripper," and it's just one of these names that carries this brutal force of inhumanity against women. But of course, I do think that the legend of Jack the Ripper has fallen into the same category as Dracula, Frankenstein, Werewolf, the Mummy, the Wolfman. Again, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. These sorts of horror characters that are fictitious, and this character has been lumped into it when actually Jack the Ripper was a name given to a very deranged serial killer.
How difficult was it for you to get over this whole mythos of an unidentified killer, a person that we all call Jack the Ripper? Because you name a suspect, you name someone who you think DNA evidence proves that this person was Jack the Ripper.
Well, that's an interesting point. It wasn't the fact of me naming him. Scotland Yard named him. So the man that actually did the murders was named officially in a book by one of the heads of the investigation. Not long, well, so about 10, a good 10, 20 years after the murder, they actually disclosed who it was. And when I actually bought the shawl that was taken from one of the murder scenes, that had been in Scotland Yard, and I found a link to the murder dates with that shawl. And it was that when I told Scotland Yard about that link, it was Scotland Yard who told me who it was. It wasn't me saying it was a suspect. I was told who Jack the Ripper was officially.
So it's just been known that there's his name's just was never carry it onto the media, or did they find it funnier to call it Jack the Ripper and make it this mysterious thing that's lasted all these years? Because even now, there's so many debates I see across about it.
Well, most of the police know. I mean, all the police who ever get trained, they know who it was. It is really a fact of it's the public perpetuating a myth, which again, as you rightly say, there is a ripperology group that love this story and love creating this mystery that what it is, but they will not accept the truth, which is actually fundamentally basic, that it was a deranged schizophrenic Polish immigrant that did come over to London and did murder these women and ended up in an asylum. But people just don't seem to be able to accept that, you know.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the suspect? I think you, from our last conversation, you called him Aaron Kosminski.
Yeah, that's right. So it was when I was looking to. So if, I've just said one thing. We because I described it before in our earlier conversation that we just want to pick up on the fact of that I'd been in the East End for 11 years, and it wasn't until I saw the film From Hell that really got me into this story. And to be honest, I was as a businessman. This is sort of like a fantasy story. It was until I called Scotland Yard, because I realised where I'd been in the East End for 11 years was literally where the story happened, where the murders happened. And when I called Scotland Yard and found out that you could go and research the case, I did. And very quickly I realised that nobody will ever be able to solve this because there is no real evidence. So it wasn't until 2007 in the March that I discovered that there was a shawl for sale, and that shawl was linked directly to the fourth murder. The pattern on the shawl was Michaelmas daisies, and Michaelmas directly relates to the murder dates of three of his five murders. So that's really what got me into this story. And of course, when you look at the shawl, you can see there's blood on it, you know, and it's clearly old. So that's really where my story really came from. But then it wasn't until I did call Scotland Yard and they did give me the name of Aaron Kosminski did I start picking up the name. Before that, I just had an inkling it might have been a guy called Frederick Bailey Demon because he was a very evil man. And he did actually live in Liverpool and he married somebody from my hometown. So it sort of got me more interested because of the links, you know. But it really wasn't him. But that's really where it started. Now, when Scotland Yard told me it was Aaron Kosminski, I number one asked why. How did they know? Now, there's a it's his memoirs of Robert Anderson, who was the head of CID at the time, so the head of the whole department, the whole thing. He wrote his memoirs, and in his memoirs, called The Lighter Side of My Official Life, he actually says that they knew the identity of Jack the Ripper. It's stated by the head of CID who investigated the criminal case of Jack the Ripper that they knew who it was. But at that time, they thought it was a lot. It was sort of, he wrote that about 1911, 1910. So it was like 22 years after the murders. So he thought, well, it's not really worth telling tales out of school. It's a little bit like that. And then in Donald Swanson's version of that book, he actually names Kosminski as the suspect and actually describes what happened. So what really happened was that after the fifth murder of Mary Jane Kelly, he tried to kill his own sister with a knife, and his brothers Wolf and Isaac had just had enough, so they gave him up to the police. He was taken outside of London with great difficulty. This is all in the book, by the way, all in his memoirs, not me making it up. And to a seaside home in Hove, where he was unhesitatingly identified by the one eyewitness that saw a man attacking. There's only one attacking one of the victims, which was Elizabeth Stride. Shortly we found she was before she was discovered. Now you will get many people say, well, she was discovered at 1 o'clock, and he was attacking at 1:45. She could have been there for 10 minutes. She could have been there for 5 minutes. You know, so it's sort of not really importance that the fact that people really stick on, well, he had 15 minutes. Well, he didn't. She was just discovered at 1 o'clock, as I say. And what happened was Israel Swartz wouldn't testify. So they had the man, but the eyewitness wouldn't testify because he was Jewish. And he didn't want to give up what they say, a fellow Jew to Gentile justice. So, in fact, With great difficulty, they give him back to his brother. He knew it was caught. It was under 24-hour watch. They then put him in Stepney Workhouse first. Then they put him in Colney Hatch, and then they finally put him in Leavesden Asylum. So basically, he was locked away shortly after the murders, but he was basically not left to run free. And that's really why the Ripper murders stopped.
Now, what about Kosminski? I mean, where were you able to find information on him, like source data? It was interesting to me. You mentioned that the archives were open for people to study the case of Jack the Ripper, which in a lot of cases, just because I have a JFK background, it's not really as open as you would like it to be. National Archives is sealed only to specific researchers for the longest time, and then even JFK files now are still fighting to get released. So that's really interesting because as a researcher of just a different subject, different time period, I'm curious how, like, what were your thoughts about them just letting you openly study the case and then also trying to look up the background of Kosminski?
Well, in the UK, this case was closed for 100 years. So the case files were opened in 1988. Now that's really interesting, 1988, because that's when a documentary with which actually names Kosminski, obviously, with Peter Ustinov that's available on YouTube. It's a fantastic documentary, and it sort of dispels the myth of the other suspects. But at the same time, that's when the Michael Caine version of Jack the Ripper came out, sort of on 1988, and that's when all the files, well, the files that were available became public. So I didn't come along till 2007, so they'd already been going for 19 years. So that they're literally available to the public. And it's interesting when you do go and do well, as you know, if you go and do the research, it's interesting to see. I've always found, I don't know about you yourself with the JFK story, primary research is the key. Don't listen to hearsay. Don't listen to somebody's theory. Go and have a look yourself, because that's the way you know the truth. That's the way you'll find the truth. That's exactly what I did. Now, the Ripper case is held at Kew, which is in one part of London, but Aaron Kosminski's case files are held somewhere else in the Metropolitan Archives, which is by Farringdon. It's not far from King's Cross. So the other side of London, far away from Kew. And that's where you've got his asylum records. But you've got to look. And I think the thing is with Kosminski, especially with any bit of research that you do, it's a fact of if you look down one avenue, it could definitely lead you into a blind alley. So always keep your sort of, your peripheral vision wide open and see if there's something else that will come up. And it did. So of course, people say, well, he was running free for 3 years before he was incarcerated. Well, he wasn't. Now, I found that he was transferred to Stepney Workhouse or Mile Workhouse before he went to Colney Hatch. So there's another document where he was transferred from. Now it's interesting because Donald Swanson, who named Kosminski, said that he was locked up in March 1889, which sounds about right, but not entirely accurate. And again, it's this confusion of when there's not one piece of information to say, that's what really happened. That's when people trying to dispel any sort of story whatsoever. So the fact is, you can actually see the case files that exist is a wonderment to me, and it was a great time. But what I can tell you is the case files of Kosminski you can't open. So I paid an archivist at the, all legally, of course, at the Metropolitan Archives to give me all the case files of Kosminski, which they did. And there's a 16-year gap on his files. So they got lost, but they disappeared. So that's quite interesting that there's none available. So it's from 1894 to 1910. There's not one thing about him, and the information on him is exceptionally scant. As there's hardly anything on him, especially when it comes to asylum records. It's like one sentence every 6 months, which is quite interesting.
Do you think that's a corruption issue? Do you think that someone took those or there was some manipulation with some of the files? Because I know some of the evidence in the Jack the Ripper case is kind of, depending on where you look, there can be some conflating information. That's why I'm really interested in the facts of the matter, but it's very hard. Like even with the JFK case, there's names of people, but they were never pursued or never investigated, or their files that just we don't have links to. So it makes it extra difficult to be like, well, I'm trying to piece it together, but I'm missing the 16 years of the guy's life.
Yeah, that's interesting because there is a lot of source data. So the historic archives at the London Hospital is another place I looked and found a huge amount of information there. And it just so happens where the hospital is situated is only 5 minutes from his front door. So I found a huge amount of information, and it does actually dismiss a few they're not suspects. Remember, only three suspects, but this dismisses a lot of these people that were named in this case by other people that wanted to make it fit their agenda. But one thing that I did have, which was I was very lucky to meet, he used to be the marshal of Leavesden Asylum, so he used to look after Leavesden, and his name's Martin, and he had a lot of source data that we wouldn't get our hands on, and he told me lots of very significant information that we wouldn't ever know. And one of them was what happened to Kosminski and the issue he had with his mother, which is one of the reasons we strove him to murder women roughly the same age as his mum, which I thought, well, that actually all fits, you know. And I think when you've got somebody that explained to me, well, there was a flood in Leavesden Asylum, apparently, and a lot of the documents went missing. That's what he was told. But as something significant as this, everybody, you go through the archives and the stories, people will say, oh, well, all this information's been hidden or it's been lost or stolen. Even Rip letters were stolen. The From Hell letter was stolen, you know, and I don't even know if that's still back there yet.
Could that could be a fame issue too, right? Like with the Zodiac killer, when they were kind of given it a publicized name in the media, people started coming forward saying, "Oh, I'm the Zodiac killer." Like, how'd you kill your victims? Like with a hammer. Well, he never killed anybody with a hammer, but it's just people wanting the attention.
That happened here with this as well. I think it was about 94 Ripper letters written to the police claiming that they were the Ripper and they were going to kill more people. So it was that, in fact, they did identify a woman that was prolific in writing these letters and prosecuted her. And basically, she did it again. She would have gone to prison for a lot longer than they gave her. So, yes, you're absolutely right. The people did. Imagine this as like a pinnacle of horror in the East End, which is what it was. And it basically started the Star newspaper. The press really grew from the story, and everybody in their own way, in a sordid, sick way, if you like, wanted to be connected to this story. Now there is a document which is actually in the Bishopsgate Library. So again, if you go to these libraries and museums, you will find this information. So in the Bishopsgate Library, it's very, very very well stated that this was an overly inflated story, that this was just blown out of proportion really by the press, which is what it was, that this was a serial killer that was murdering women. They caught him, they put him away, and that was that. But this was, the press really did fly and sell a lot of newspapers for this. And I think that's what's stuck in the psyche. So I would, you'd say, yeah, I don't know about the US, and they don't know too much about the story, because I know a lot of the US people come on my tours. But what I can tell you is, um, it isn't this big mad mystery that it always was. It was a case of a serial killer from Poland that murdered 5 women. He was caught and put in asylum. And I don't think people want that to be the truth. I think people want it to be the myth, because that's what propels this story into the stratosphere of mystery, if you like.
Maybe we can talk about some of the killings. We can probably start off with the first one. What did you notice about any of them that had similarities? Obviously, they're what we would call women of the night. Um, but it seemed like, from what I could tell, a lot of people are saying this person must have had a medical background because the way that the cuts were and the organs and stuff were taken out. And what made you think the schizophrenic one was a match? I know you mentioned the mother, and kind of the hatred for them. But still, stabbing and then cutting out organs and stuff like that kind of makes it seem like the person had a little bit more expertise or some type of sick.
Well, that's exactly correct. You're right. There were two coroners. One said he did have anatomical knowledge, and the other one said he didn't. Because if he said he did have anatomical knowledge, all the focus would have been on the Royal London Hospital, and the surgeons would have been definitely a target for hate. Now, Kosminski, when he was arrested, his asylum record said hairdresser or barber surgeon. So barber surgeons back then had anatomical knowledge, not enough to be a surgeon, but certainly had it. And that's where he definitely had that. Now, I unearthed with the new book, which actually I get stock of tomorrow, it was released. I found out that his grandfather was a butcher. So his paternal grandfather was a butcher. So obviously the whole family were master tailors, but they would have been passed down some sort of knowledge of, skill, you know. But when we get to the first murder, now again, four of them were in the 40s, which is the same age as his mum when she had him, and that was more to do with circumstance, and I'll go on to that. But again, you're looking at somebody drunk, somebody that's out very late at night. So Polly Nichols or Marianne Nichols on the 31st of August, she didn't have a DOS money, and she was kicked out of a lodging house in Thrall Street, where she ended up very far away, actually, very, very far away from where she should have been. And where he lived, it's 10 minutes from his front door. It's also near to a Jewish cemetery, so he definitely would have basically scoped out where he could commit these crimes. It wasn't just a crime of opportunity. And he took her at the place called Bucks Row. It's now Durwood Street. And at 3:45, a guy called Charles Cross came across the body of Polly Nichols with another guy called Robert Paul, and they went to get help from a policeman. But in that time they went to find a police officer, another police officer called PC Neal. He discovered the body, and it was only when he got the body to the mortuary in Old Montague Street, which is literally very close to the whole story. In fact, Old Montague Street is about where her body was taken from where she was kicked out is 5 minutes. They didn't realize that the connective tissue, so everything, all the muscle, the skin, the bone, everything, just the spine was left intact. Had all been cut, everything, and her bowels were protruding. The other significant thing about this, how we call the canonical five, and they say that they were strangled or throttled at first, so they didn't, suffer. I would say they suffered, but they didn't suffer the atrocities he did to them. That was done post-mortem. That really, he laid them out with the legs apart, arms stretched out, the palms up, with the heads to the left. So he positioned them, as we get into the story, he placed body parts around the body as well. So that was the first thing. Now, with Polly being murdered on the 31st of August, it did raise eyebrows, but it was a case of Whitechapel at the time, this sort of vile, destitute area where the impoverished dwell. So it was just sort of like a street prostitute, that's what goes on over there. But a week after, so 8 days later, it was Annie Chapman. Now, Annie Chapman, or Dark Annie, again, she had a very nice life at some point when she lived with her husband, John Chapman, over in Ascot. They did live in Knightsbridge for a little bit. They had 3 children. One of them died. Her daughter died at age 12, so Annie just literally fell into alcoholism. John kicked her out. She ended up down in Whitechapel, down the Doss houses. She ended up staying in 35 Dorset Street, which is where the 5th victim was discovered, in her house, in her room. Now, it was in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street when he inflicted his atrocities on her. This was like a week after. Now, the other thing is, again, Annie didn't have a 4-penny DOS money, same as Polly. So she was literally out on the streets in the dead of night with hardly anybody about. Now, where he took Polly's life in the street, he took Polly's life in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Now, there is a book saying they weren't prostitutes. Well, they were. They were. they were basically living a day-to-day existence, and if they had to sell the body, they did. And it's as simple as that. But when he got to Annie, he really did inflict terror to the community in a very heinous way. So what he did is he did the same where he cut her throat, but he also disemboweled her, put her intestines over his shoulder, and he took a uterus with him. Now, when you say this is somebody. This is 1888. This isn't modern day crime. This is like a very historic crime. So he definitely would have had to know where the uterus was and what the uterus actually looked like to take it. The other thing is, I was in
Shit,
the.
there's some people that don't know what it looks like.
Well, let me just tell you this. It's about. I was at the Royal Surgeons Museum, which is in Lincoln's Inn Field, a very fascinating place where you get to see all of this stuff. And the uterus, which carries the baby, is about this big. So it's not a small thing, and you've got to know what it is, because he did take the uterus of the fourth, at the fifth victim. There was nothing left of Mary Kelly, to be fair. And then he disappeared. And again, Annie Chapman was laid out the same way as Polly. A very clear connection between the two murders. Now, this is when it really hit London. This really did grip Whitechapel with fear. Policemen were given double shifts, and a vigilance committee, so the locals all clubbed together to patrol these streets to try and find this man. Now I'm going to pause here. I'm going to tell you something that I don't really say on many interviews, but I'm going to give you a connection that's never been really brought up. So 3 weeks before Polly Nichols was murdered, Martha Tabram was stabbed 39 times to her death. She was out with a woman called Pearlie Poll. Polly Nichols is the first victim. When we get to Annie Chapman, there's an eyewitness called Elizabeth Long who sees her with a man before she's murdered. Long Liz, or Elizabeth Stride, is the third murder victim. When we get to Catherine Eddowes, the fourth victim, when she was arrested, she gave her name as nothing. When she was released, she gave her name as Mary Ann Kelly. Mary Jane Kelly was the fifth victim.
Is the Mary a connection or just like a weird thing that he has about him?
The
Yeah.
names, so Pearlie Poll, Polly Nichols, when Annie Chapman was murdered, Elizabeth Long. Long Liz was the name of Elizabeth Stride. She was murdered. We get to Catherine Eddowes. Catherine Eddowes gives the name when she's in the prison out of the fifth victim. And 5 weeks later, Mary Jane Kelly's murdered. So nobody really picks up on that.
That's
But yeah,
weird.
yeah, that's something I really keep to myself, because again, we solved it officially with DNA. So that I can tell you. But this thing's always, I would say, tested my mind, if you like. They said, well, hang on a sec. There's a link with the names here, and no one's really put that together. You know.
Did Kosminski, did he have any psychiatric evaluations or anything that happened
Yes,
in
yes, yes. So there was in 1891, and this is the thing about information. In fact,
the
it's
reason
not
I
with
only
me.
bring that up is because a lot of the stuff with like Cold War stuff, I know this is way later, but there's a hypnosis factor where people can get triggered and angered, and a lot of times it's certain phrases and sayings, and I wonder if certain individuals, if they say a name and it becomes like the name in the fifth victim or something like that. I don't think it's foreknowledge or something like that, but I wonder if that could be like a trigger mechanism for
It could
them to
well
get
be.
angry, and that it becomes
It
an
could well
obsession.
be. Yeah, you know what? It could well be. I know as a therapist myself, hypnotherapy can do a lot of things that people don't, that people underestimate, is the best way I can put it. But really, Kosminski, again, at some point, so it's definitely, he was identified before 1891, obviously, that there's a thing called the McNaughton Memorandum that was written in February 1891. And in there, it states that Kosminski, there's three suspects. He was named, but only the surname. He had homicidal tendencies and a bitter hatred of women. And he was everything evidence pointed that he was a strong suspect. So, yeah, there was an evaluation of him. And of course, when he went into the asylum, he was suffering from mania. But solitary vices back then was masturbation. So that's what it was termed as. And we know that schizophrenics publicly masturbate. Auditory hallucinations, so hearing voices. That's another a key for schizophrenia. But back then it was named as mania, and so that's what in his asylum records was mania. So yeah, it was clear that he was suffering with schizophrenia. Nowadays, as we know, because we look at bipolar, and that's a spectrum condition, that we look at bipolarity, but we also look at schizophrenia. It's now sort of like a big clock, if you think of it like this, with bipolar and schizophrenia, and you look at it as schizoaffective now. So he was clearly mentally ill. The one thing that I don't know is the trigger. What was it that made him commit his first murder? That's the one thing I don't know. But I look at it, and really, I looked at there was one of his nieces died in 1887 called Rachel, and I'm wondering if that had something to do with it, but I don't think it was. You know, she died of diphtheria. I thought he might have inadvertently murdered her by accident, or so there was an accident and he was responsible. But there's nothing. There's no key other than the dates for the three murders. It's just 29th of September, the 8th of November when he went and murdered the nights he went and murdered three of his five victims. There's no real other link of why he started. We know why he finished.
The night he murdered two victims, I think
Yeah,
he.
the double event. Yeah,
Do you think it was because he was interrupted on the
yeah,
first one? Okay.
absolutely. So as you can imagine, Robbie, I when I park my car, I always park in Berners Street. I always say hello to the victims. On the 29th of September, I go and sit in Mitre Square, roughly at that time, just to sit just with the moment of Catherine Eddowes. What I did, just so you know, many years ago, I was honoured to unveil a blue plaque commemorating the life of Catherine Eddowes, on the house where she lived, which is still there. What happened was, if you look at the scene, which is Duffield Yard, and you walk to the front door of where Kosminski lived, it's 500 yards. It's literally the road opposite. You got Berners Street, Commercial Road, Greenfield Street, and he lived there right at the end. So he literally had to go out and do it, to perform this on this night, for the Michaelmas connection. So at that time, it was Israel Swartz that saw him attacking Elizabeth or Long Liz at 1:45 in the first hour of the 30th of September 1888. Israel Swartz ran when the murderer sort of pointed and said Lipsky to him, and another man run after him. But Elizabeth Stride, she only, I say only, that there was no disembowelment. So the thing he did was he just cut her throat, didn't take any body parts with him. And because he was so furious, if you see the murder pictures of Catherine Eddowes, you can see he inflicted full horror on her. And I don't think he had the window of opportunity to strangle her, and then, because he had what he did took 4 minutes. I know that for a scientific investigation is the best way I can put it. And so he needed that body part, but you can just see that it was just awful what he did to Catherine. And he literally had a window of opportunity of 6 minutes to do the whole thing and disappear.
Can I ask why a name leather apron comes up a lot when you're looking at this case?
Yeah, that's an interesting. I know I'm writing in. It's interesting, Robbie. You've just hit the nail on the head with me. I'm writing a graphic novel, and the fourth issue I'm writing right now, and it's called Capture Leather Apron. So it's about this story. So there was a guy called John Pizer that basically bullied these women, and his nickname was Leather Apron. Now, when we get to the murder of Annie Chapman, in the backyard of 29 Hamley Street, there was a piece of leather apron, and then the press took it and it just stuck. So it was like Capture Leather Apron, and that's where it comes to. I may just say, if the Dear Boss letter wasn't sent on the 27th of September 1888, given the name Jack the Ripper, this murderer would have been known as Leather Apron in history.
Do you ever wonder with the boss letter anything suspicious about it? It was always weird that it talked about not being able to write in blood, but having to use red ink.
I think, yeah, it was written by an enterprising journalist. Going back to Robert Anderson, They actually identified who wrote that letter, and it was an enterprising journalist.
Who would you say, I guess, when you're really trying to look at this as a fact-based thing based on what the media created as a story, who was the biggest, in your mind, I guess, culprit of misinformation? Was it the media, or do you think the police played a role? Because I noticed both those kind of paint a different picture of Jack the Ripper, which is like, I know you're supposed to trust source material, but I don't know, it just seems like it would get harder as the years have gone on, but from what I've heard, it's gotten easier to understand who Jack the Ripper was.
Yeah, it is definitely the press, the media. They fed the public with these stories, and again, sensationalism because it sold papers. So yeah, it was definitely the press. I don't think the police would have obfuscated the stories the best way I can put it. I do think it was just the press. In fact, Scotland Yard have always been very fair with me and the curator of the Black Museum as I did the work and I called to verify what I'd found. He was always plain and very clear with me. Yes, that's right. This is wrong. No, it's not him. And it was Scotland Yard that told me the whole story once I worked out who the eyewitness was. Because of course, this I could throw again anybody picking up this case from the very very beginning. The first thing you'll notice there's a sea of names, a sea of people, all who's this, who's that, who's this, and it's just never ending, and it's layered in complexity is the best way I can put it. So just to unravel it, you've got to be able to unpick the story, understand it, collate it, and process it in a way that makes sense for you. When you're dealing with Scotland Yard, they don't want somebody to, they don't want to do the work for you, but they will help you if they understand that you are really genuinely interested in this case, you know. And anything really left of Scotland, it's in the crime museum. So the book I'm telling you, the lighter side of my official life, is in Scotland Yard's training museum, so you can actually see it, you know.
When it comes to interacting with the people who call themselves ripperologists, have you seen a pushback or have you seen a positive? I'm always interested in the community divides on things because obviously with the JFK thing, pick a theory because there's a lot of them out there and a lot of people are really entitled to their theories or want to stick by them to the end. And it makes it difficult if you kind of have a different conclusion.
Interesting. That you're absolutely right. Now, I came to the conclusion before I bought the shawl, before I knew of the existence of the shawl, that nobody would ever know the true identity. I've actually studied the case files myself. So I've done 10 years at uni, so I know how to do, professional research. I can tell you, if it wasn't for the shawl, I wouldn't believe anybody, and I would just know that it would never be solved. It wasn't until that we did the DNA analysis that we extracted uncontaminated blood from that shawl and we matched it with the direct female descendants of the victim did we knew we were on the right track. It wasn't until we extracted the semen and we discovered on the shawl and we discovered that the shawl didn't belong to the victim, it belonged to the murderer, did we realize that that's we're on the right track. It wasn't until we got the direct female descendants from the murderer himself and matched the DNA did we know that it was actually the man that was named by Scotland Yard over 110 years ago. So that's what makes my story different. We did it with scientific analysis, with evidence, real evidence that exists. And of course, the first thing I did was spoke to the curator of Scotland Yard and told him. And he congratulated me, you know. But the thing is, they're all dead. So that nobody can be brought to justice now. They're all dead.
What about talking to the family members and telling them kind of the truth of the
Oh yeah,
matter?
I'm in touch with descendants from his family, and I'm in touch with descendants of the victims' families as well, quite regularly. In fact, what I can tell you, only 5 days ago, I was in touch with his one of his direct female family uh, members.
Are they shocked? I mean, I would be
No, no, no.
angry.
It's historic now. It's so long ago, but they're very happy for me what I've done, and they congratulate me. And in fact, at one point we tried to exhume him. They tried to help me exhume him. So they're all for the story as well. They want to close just as much as we all. Well, I say we all do. We've got the name. We want to close the case. That's the point of what we're doing now. Well, what we've done now. I did try and close the case with the Attorney General, and the Attorney General said that the actual show would have been very important if we knew what we knew today. Now, there's a barrister that has been working on the case to present a case to the High Court. Now, a High Court barrister doesn't mess around, so if he didn't think this was real, so I'll just give you a perspective. If you watch a documentary and you make your mind up that that's Jack the Ripper, good luck to you. If you go down a blind alley and you come up with a spurious name and you believe that's Jack the Ripper, good luck to you. I've got no time for you. These ripperologists, these so-called experts on the case, great, good luck to you. But I have no time for people that have will not sit and listen to the real truth. A High Court barrister who's analysed everything that's on this case, and I've done it with him over 5 years. This is what he said. Oh, and before we go any further, he's also got a PhD in biochemistry, so he fully understands the science. So when anybody comes at me and to say, well, this science, that science, are you a forensic analyst? No, but I believe what I see on Google. That's the problem with the story. Just throw so much at it that it's just confusion. This is the truth. This is what the statements of High Court barrister stated, which I put out on my page 3 weeks ago. If the newly discovered DNA evidence was available to the coroner back in 1888 at the time of the Ripper murders, it would have been justifiable to arrest Aaron Kosminski and have him prosecuted for the murder of Catherine Eddowes and the other 4 so-called Ripper murders. That's an official statement. So we know we've got him. So it's this thing, Robbie, of actually having the patience to explain to somebody that doesn't want to listen. And for those people, I haven't got the time.
I want to ask you about this, but the canonical five, I've heard that there's a couple or two victims beforehand that could be kind of linked to the Jack Ripper murders. I don't know if you've ever heard that before, but
Of course. It's Martha Tabram. I mentioned it before.
yeah, the one who's stabbed 39 times.
Yeah, now she was 39 at the time of the murders. And if you look at her mortuary photograph, she looks a lot older to me. Now, Martha, I do believe that because it was 39 times and not just once, that's a very personal attack. You know, I do believe that was the first victim. She was his first try because only 3 weeks later, so you remember, 27th of August 1888, Martha Tabram. 31st, so 3 weeks later, Polly. 1 week later, Annie. 3 weeks later, Catherine and Elizabeth. And then 5 weeks later, Mary Kelly. Mary Kelly was more to do with opportunity because she had her own room. So he couldn't murder on the streets. They were too well protected. So because he could take her in her room and be, say, cordoned off to the world or closed off to the world, he did everything he ever wanted to inflict on a woman in that one moment, you know. But I do think, yeah, and again, as we know, serial killers, they do sort of escalate their atrocities as they get more confident and more, I'd hate to say it, but proficient with their craft, if you like.
Did you think that he was knowing what was going on while he was doing it? Or do you think, like a lot of people, serial killers or mass killers at least, want to be kind of publicized? It's always been theorized that they want some public attention. That's why media stopped reporting names on certain terrorists because they believe that they were incentivizing people to want to get fame that way, which is a dirty way to get it, obviously. But usually, like a killer, like a serial killer who leaves notes and letters and all these types of things like Riddle, it's you can see it in Sherlock Holmes, but they kind of want to be caught. And I'm curious if you came across that at all with him, or was this just someone that seemed like they were in their own world? Like the final kill, would that have been his final one? Did he have another one planned, or was it just something where he just, there's no trace and he's just gone?
What a fascinating, do you know what, Robbie? This is one of the best interviews I've ever given. I can tell you this: if you look at BTK, Dennis Rader, he did want to get caught, and he goaded the police and left clues until they actually found him. So there's one where, you know, a very good example of what someone wanting to get caught. But with him, when you say this, the one thing that strikes everybody who comes to walk with me in Whitechapel is the proximity of the murders. They're all very, very, very close. Where he lived was 7 minutes from where Polly was drinking that night. 7 minutes walk from his doorstep to Martha Tabram. It's 3 minutes walk from his front door to Elizabeth Stride. I think he knew he would have got caught if he did anything any further. But when he was identified, Donald Swanson swears where he knew he'd been caught. So there's no way he was going to do anything anyway. I don't think he would have had the opportunity to leave notes, and he didn't. I think this was all the highest risk possible. He almost got seen on the third murder. He definitely was seen with Catherine Eddowes before she was murdered. There's an alleged story that he was seen by a witness for Mary Kelly, a guy called George Hutchinson, did a statement. I don't think he wanted to get caught. That's very clear. But I don't think he go to the police except one letter, and that's the From Hell letter. And the From Hell letter was sent to the head of the Vigilance Committee, not the newspapers, not the police, the head of the Vigilance Committee that didn't live too far from Aaron Kosminski. And that was sent with half a human kidney on the 16th of October, 1888. And it says that he fried half and ate it. It was very nice. And we know that Catherine Eddowes' kidney was taken from her body only just over 2 weeks before that. So that's the only letter, the From Hell letter, because it's not signed Jack the Ripper. All of the others are. And it's written, it's interesting, because the word knife, because we say a foreigner wrote that letter. A knife, as you well know, is spelled K-N-I-F-E. But in the letter, it's spelled K-N-I-F. Now, if he was a semi-literate, he would have written N-I-F-E, knife, and wouldn't have known there was a silent K at the front. So that's sort of a clue of, well, this guy was educated. And it feels a little bit contrived, the letter. And it's written sort of slash, sort of, if you look at the letter, the words are sort of this type of thing, you know. I do think that's probably, I'm not saying he wrote it, what I'm saying is that's the one that merits attention. The only thing is, it was taken to Leman Street Police Station, or the City Police Station after the murders, when it was discovered by sent to George Lusk, and then I think a week later it disappeared.
I don't know if you've ever heard of this suspect before. I can't remember his name, but have you ever looked into someone that worked with bodies, a mortician? Anyone that would have the proper tools that would be used for the type of job, or anyone that would have, I guess, access to the autopsies? I mean, how, I guess, much coverage or examinations were done when it came to the autopsies of these individuals? Were they examined in the proper formats?
Interesting question. What I can say to you is this, Robbie. If the name wasn't given to me by Scotland Yard, I most likely wouldn't have done the work, because it took me 14 years anyway with the name given to me to prove it. With so many people out there, it would have taken me more than now to find a descendant of any of these people, of which they don't deserve any attention at all because they weren't the murderer. It was purely because the name Aaron Kosminski was given to me by Scotland Yard, and it was explained to me why it was him and how they knew it was him. Did I pursue that pathway, if you like? So no, and before I knew, as I say, Demon was a vile human being. He murdered his 4 children, 3 of his wives, and he was hanged in Australia because he disappeared. He was I would say, as they go, I can't imagine somebody murdering their own children. I just can't envisage that or accept that. But that's what he did. I think his youngest, was 1.5 years old. He buried them under the kitchen hearth and then had a party and brought the local community, and literally in that kitchen where the bodies were buried. Denham Villas up in Rainhill it was. So I looked into him at first because I thought that this is a really nasty man. But I realised he wasn't here at the minute. The thing is, again, H.H. Holmes is a classic fantasy story. If H.H. Holmes was in London at the time of the murders, he would have most definitely had to have known the area, and he didn't. And Buffalo Bill was in the area, so it could have been Buffalo Bill. You wait for it. All these people bring out all these names. Since I've named him, that's really stopped. There's only a few now. But widely, anyone with half a brain realizes, actually, this guy's got a bit, he's actually got a story. I wouldn't have bothered at all if Scotland Yard didn't give me his name.
Can I ask about the changes and maybe the background to Whitechapel, like kind of how it was before compared to what changed after these murders? Um, I think that plays a big factor because I mean, just taking a shot in the dark here. I mean, yeah, a bunch of people probably stumble in the street, maybe a few people in the middle of the night. So you're vulnerable, and if you're a woman at the time, I mean, I don't know what it was back then, but I'm sure that if they heard a woman screaming, they probably thought it was an altercation or a domestic violence issue, and a lot of people just looked the other way at first.
Yeah, yeah. If we go back to that time, where Queen Victoria, she was on the throne. We had Victorian Britain. We were the hub, the financial hub, the richest, one of the richest countries in the world. We had the empire, and it was this little haven of hell, is the best way I can put it, or the abyss, as Jack London said. That really, this is a place where the destitute lived. That's what it was, and there were about 1,600 prostitutes. There are about 68 active working brothels in that very small area. So that's where the sailors would go. You get everybody going there really for entertainment in that way. Um, the one positive thing that came out of this 10 years after, all this poverty was stopped. It basically changed the landscape of Whitechapel. Now, I was there on Saturday and somebody pointed out to me, because I've been there 35 years, somebody pointed out to me the streets are still the same. There's a lot of the place that's still there. A lot of it's gone, but a lot of it's still there if you know where to look, which is where I take everybody to show you old London. Um, but on the whole, the conditions got better. Children were sold back then. To work, and I think it was 1860, and before that, where they would be sold as little babies. 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds getting sent up chimneys to clean chimneys. That's what it was like back then. This all changed, and it radicalized the area, so it wasn't too bad. However, we come to today. There's echoes of that. There's still a very huge drug problem down there. There's a huge homeless problem down there. You can smell cannabis. You can still smell urine on the streets. It's still rough. It's not that pleasant, to be honest. Even though, for me, I love it. It's got something else for me. It's just beautiful in certain parts of that. But it's reminiscent. Today is reminiscent of those times. Is the best way I can put it.
And when you came up with the overall, this is the person, I mean, what were your thoughts about looking into other areas of the case? Because obviously, if you have the name and then everything that you've done DNA wise match that name, what about for you? Besides, I mean, you can end it, but with the JFK case, they always say people never want to end the mystery or something like that, which is very true in a lot of these circumstances. But for me, I'm always finding another rock to unturn, not when it leads to who did it, but just something more knowledgeable about the time, adds more experience because without a time machine and being able to see it and experience it for yourself, you're just constantly learning more details and things where you go, oh, that's an interesting tidbit.
Do you know, Robbie? You're absolutely right. And the other thing is, I use that same analogy. I unturned stones. So the best way I can put it is, and I remember saying this 15 years ago for the first documentary. Imagine a beach full of pebbles. I've just unturned all those pebbles. But you're right, there's always a pebble to unturn, but not on this case. About the conditions, about the area, yes. But on the case, it's over. I've not done any investigation now for oh, years,
Still
years.
knowledgeable as ever, though.
Oh yeah, it's sort of in there. But I did do another cold case, which we've done, but I'm under contract not to discuss that. And I've solved another huge British one, but I can't discuss that. And then, of course, I've got another one I want to do. I spoke to one of the experts on this case, and it's basically consumed his whole life, and he's now at the point where he's retired. And he said, "I always just wanted to do something else, but this story keeps bringing you back." I managed to let that go. I still do this, but this isn't my life as it used to be. Um, as I said, there's a really great moment in the film Zodiac where you've got Jake Gyllenhaal playing Robert. Is it Greensmith or the guy that actually found
Mark,
the
Mark,
murderer?
Mark Smith.
Was it okay? And what it was He's in his room. It's full of boxes of research, and that's what where we get to. And you get to a point where you know every single fact of this case, and you do because I've unravelled everything. But at some point, you step back and say, "Well, actually, you know what? I've done that now. I can close that and I can move on." Now, I did 10 years ago, but people wouldn't let me say, "Yeah, that's it." So I took another 10 years to do something very fantastical, which will come out. The book's available literally this Friday, which explains a lot of the next part of this journey. So why he was never put in prison. One of them is to do with his Ross. There's something else that's really big. The reason for why he murdered the way he did, that's coming out. That's another big thing for what he did. And just what happened to him afterwards and before. Um, so yeah, there's a good few things. And again, I've solved something. The Jewers are the men and not be blamed for nothing. The Goulston Street graffito that was discovered about 2:50 in the morning. I found the answer for that and why it was rubbed off, and I know what it meant. And this is in this next book that's coming out, which is the definitive reveal, Jack the Ripper, naming Jack the Ripper, the definitive reveal.
Did you find it strange that there was kind of this anti-Jewish sentiment or this sentiment about this kind of, it plays a factor in the JFK case too, because Jack Ruby.
Yeah, exactly the same. So what happened was there was a huge influx. I think 28,000 Jewish immigrants fled the pogroms in Poland in 1881 and flooded Whitechapel. They took up every job. So a job they would do at a fraction. So here's your day-to-day life, and somebody's going to do it for a fraction of what you get paid, and you're out of work. So they literally just flooded the East End. At the moment, I experience a lot of hatred about the Bangladeshi community who live there now and very happily, which is the area I've known the Bangladeshi community for over 3.5 decades, and I love it. But there's still a lot of racism with that, most definitely. That's the same with the Jewish people. When population came over and they were made to, and there was a huge amount of anti-Semitism at this time, and this is something that's missed. So you've got this Jew that murdered women in Whitechapel. So if that really did come out, that's another one of the reasons why his name wasn't given out, was because it would have just the anti-Semitic riots would have been untold. There is something else which has never been investigated until I, again, like you said, I unravelled something. There was a huge fear of the Irish. They were called Fenians back then. And this was more to do with the assassination or the attempted assassination threat on Queen Victoria. So there was a lot of going on at the time. And in fact, the 10-week period of the Ripper was a blip in the bigger investigation of the Fenians. And all the names, the investigators of the Ripper case were involved in this as well. And that's the reason why the guy that found the shawl, Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson, found it, and he was there because he was on Fenian duties that night. That's why in one of the houses there, because he was a lookout. Because back then, Scotland Yard was bombed in 1884 by the Irish, and they found some of the bomb-making material in one of the houses in Mitre Square. So they thought they'd keep a lookout for that because it's not far from the docks, and they used that as a base. And it just happened to be him that discovered the shore.
That's so strange.
Yeah, I think when you need to when you investigate the story, it's always good to speak to somebody that's done everything, every single angle to discover. I found.
I think you're really knowledgeable on it. I'd love to get you in a chat with another person who studied Jack the Ripper. He did name, he does think that there's seven, not five, suspects, and he does examine more of the coroner, one of the coroners, and he brings up a good point. But you guys are both very calm in your, and I'm sure it's probably a very divided community, much like the JFK thing. It was hard to get JFK researchers together, but you both give very detailed stuff, and basically everything that you've said, with just a little bit more detail, he's kind of agreed on, from the chat I had with him, which is interesting because, you know, I'm very kind of pausing with the media. on a lot of stuff because I think that they care more about the story and how much papers they can sell compared to wanting the facts behind things. And if you look at a lot of crimes throughout history, unsolved murders and mysteries, like the death of Natalie Wood, the famous actress, the story and the answer, like Sam Peroni I've had on the show, he's got it. It's everything's lined up, but no questions were ever asked to the press because they had a relationship or they got something out of it, or it was a story that was better to solve or sell because it's unsolved. And I'm like, man, you know how much history and how many people just like go online and create so many different theories where anyone like myself that would be new to ripperology or anything like that, I go and Google it,
Yeah,
take your whose pick of what suspect you want and where everyone's avenue is. And I get it, everyone does their own research, sure, but there's only one way it happened. And
yeah,
we got to kind of get on a basis of at least everyone having a general discussion or understanding of the case.
yeah, yeah. That's absolutely true.
I'm actually excited for your next part to come out on it so I can get some of that info on there. I know you don't want to reveal too much about it, but you,
It's out on Amazon now in the US. You just can't get it in the UK. It's only getting really. We sold out day one, and it's taken them another 6 weeks of, believe it or not, politics. Amazon got involved. There was all sorts going on. So my book should have come out 7 weeks ago. I'm only getting it again. So the first set just went, and then they held back. And there was I wouldn't say there was a conspiracy from Amazon, but lots of things have happened to stop this book getting out again.
and now, do you think that was because you named somebody, or do you think it was
No,
because
we named it 10 years ago. No, it's something else that's big in the book.
okay. I won't get you to share that. Everyone will have to just read the book and find out. But I do appreciate you giving me the time and being able to work with me on schedules and stuff like that to make this happen.
Pleasure.
Um, is
Thank you,
there
Robbie.
is there a place where people can find any of your links from social media links to where the book can be found?
Yes, so the website is the jackthерippertour.co.uk. My Facebook page is the Jack the Ripper Experience. My name is Russell Stephen Edwards. The Stephen's got a PH. I'm on Instagram, I think, and on Twitter at Rippertour LDN. But if you look up Russell Edwards, you'll find me. You know, and don't believe everything you read. That's
And
the one thing.
I'll make sure any links I can find for you. I'll make sure to link in the description below so people can be able to find your contact information and things of that sort if they have questions. And also when they buy your book, I'm sure people are going to want you to sign it, man. Trust me. People
Oh,
love when their books are signed.
well, you know what? There's a guy that wrote The Final Solution, Stephen Knight. Some of when he's dead now. I've got a book that he signed in 1977. Obviously, it wasn't The Final Solution, and I think that was knocking around for 3 grand.
There you go.
So it'd be better, my books would be better signed and then me dead, for a collector's thing.
I'll just send a copy to you while you're alive so you can sign it real
Yeah,
quick and send it back to me.
exactly, exactly.
Well, Mr.
Yeah.
Edwards, thank you again. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.